Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with the University of Michigan Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. And today our guest is Professor Yasmeen Hanoosh. Hi, Yasmeen.
Hello, Yam.
So I've known Yasmeen for a very long time. She has been, when I met you, you were writing and you were studying. And you were living in Michigan. So Yasmeen was born in Baghdad. Is that correct?
Basra.
Basra. Okay, she was born in Basra, and you're gonna tell us a little bit about your background. You were born in Basra. When did you come to the United States, and the journey that has led you to where you are today?
Yeah, gladly. First of all, I would like to thank you, Yam, for hosting me in this show. I'm delighted to be here and to connect with folks in Michigan and elsewhere. It was my first encounter with the US, moving there in 1995. I was born in the port city of Basra in southern Iraq, and 2 years before the Iraq-Iran war started. And as you know, anybody who's lived through that war, you know that the bombing turned into to targeting the urban centers in the south. So our town was bombed and our house was eventually bombed during that long 8-year long war. And eventually I moved to Baghdad. So maybe that's why you think I'm from Baghdad.
Yes, I think we talked about it before, yes.
Yes, probably. And my time in Iraq was split between those two cities. First Basra for the first 8 years of my life, and then Baghdad. And then shortly after the second Gulf War, 1991, things continued to deteriorate economically and safety-wise. And we moved to the suburbs of Detroit in 1995. During the embargo years, and that's where my journey began in this country. And one of the things that I was struck by when I arrived at the age of 17 to Detroit is how different the Chaldean community was in terms of conceptualizing its identity compared to the Chaldeans that I knew in Iraq. So that became a point of interest for me. I wanted to understand how those shifts in identification were happening, what mechanisms were there at play to change the community's conception of itself. So I could talk about this more unless you want to ask me another question.
Yeah, well, yes, because you did end up writing a book that I know. So the book is called The Chaldeans, and a lot of the people that I do interview, and it's available on Amazon, people can get it. It's The Chaldeans, Politics and Identity in Iraq and the American Diaspora. So from reading this book, I saw that you started this project early on. And I know from before, from the way you would interview people, you interviewed me, you interviewed Dinyan, and there was that interest to understand their identity and see their viewpoint. So what led you, maybe if you, share what led you to writing this book, or the experience, and now you just mentioned part of it, but the experience that led you to spend this is 15-year project.
Yes, at least, yes.
Yeah.
Only 15 years, but I think it started in my mind and heart long before that. So again, it was, let's go back to that first encounter with the Chaldean community in Metro Detroit. One of the first things that struck me was how public this identity has become. Growing up in Iraq in a Chaldean family, our Chaldean identity was mostly confined to the context of the church. You know, we knew that we belonged to a denomination that was Catholic and Chaldean, and the term was used in reference to liturgy, to rites, to our religious practices. So it was a strictly religious identity. Whereas when I moved here, I noticed that people are referring to themselves as Chaldeans as an ethnic identity. Now, this ethnic identity, we have to keep in mind, oftentimes we don't know, it's a very recent development. The whole idea of ethnicity is relatively recent. It's about 100 years old. And so Chaldeanness in Iraq was a religious identity, and most people identified ethnically as Arab. When the label Arab was more positive, or did not carry all those negative connotations that it came to carry after 9/11, after a series of events that politicized Islam and made it something undesirable all throughout the world, yeah, not just in Detroit, but those events enforce the idea that Chaldeanness is something that is more than religious. It's an ethnic identity, it's an intrinsic identity. And along with that came a certain packaging of that label in the West, in America, for outsiders. Yeah. So in Iraq, usually Chaldeans identified as, for outsiders, they identified as Iraqi Christians or Arab Christians. And the term Chaldean was seldom used outside of the religious church context. Whereas in the US, what I found out was that it was coming to replace the identity of Arab. The same group of people, as they immigrated to the West, they wanted to shed their Arabness and embrace their Chaldeanness. Now, this is not a question of right and wrong. I often get asked, like, is it right? Is it wrong to say that we are ethnically Chaldean? What's wrong with that? That's not the point of my inquiry or my book. There's no right and wrong in identification, but identification is a process. So that's the main thing I would like to shed light on in my research, that it's a process, it's a fluid process, it's flexible, it changes over time, it doesn't stay still, and it serves real, practical, and strategic purposes. You know, when you're being persecuted,
that's what I was going to say, though. Isn't part of the reason is that, you know, they kind of awoke to the possibility that they can shed light on their ethnicity, or even if it's on a religious level, but that they can look deeper into that, because it's not something that we, you know, in the Arab world or in Iraq, I know that we don't study any history past 1400 years ago. And so isn't part of them, when they are coming to a country, that they can look deeper into their identity, they are kind of discovering it as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is an opportunity. There's freedom of expression that allows people to embrace whichever side of their identity they wish to focus on. And for this group of Iraqi Christians that have been historically persecuted over so many decades, it made total sense to focus on their differences, the fact that they're indigenous to Mesopotamia, the fact that their history predates the Islamic Empire in the region, and all those values. But the interesting part is that it wasn't always like that. Now, when we think about history in the present, we're not really looking at all of history. Oftentimes we're not objective. We are looking at history selectively. And what I found fascinating is how the Chaldean community in modern times skipped over so many centuries to go back to pre-Christian times to claim a very old identity, namely the ancient Chaldean identity. And that selection was had its own political agenda, had its own justification that I would love to get into during this interview. It's not the only possible identity that we could have reached back to. Yeah, we have a long Christian history dating all the way from the beginning of the Church of the East that started around 403 and 31 in the modern era. But we don't really talk about that long, fascinating Christian history as much as we do about our pre-Christian Chaldean identity. So why? I pose the question of why in my book.
Well, that's true. And that's why I ended up emailing you a load of questions, because I like, it's very intriguing that you do bring these questions to service. We've been debating this, not me and you, but the communities keep debating the names. And I really like, that's very, your book is very thorough in its research, and anybody that's interested, what it does is like you get us to ask questions. Like in my case, I sent you so many questions, and the reason is because I'm really curious, and I know that it's not enough in half an hour, but one of the things that came to mind, there was a part where you said that, you know, you questioned whether, or people questioned whether who came first, the Nestorians or the Chaldeans, which title came first. But then it says that the Nestorians, which I didn't know this, were the followers of Nestorius, who was a patriarch, correct?
Yes, the Patriarch of Constantinople before the
Yes. And so then in this case, so the question that popped up in my head is, well, then who were the followers? Wouldn't they have been, if not the Chaldeans or whoever that group, whoever took on the name Nestorian, which I thought that they were, I didn't know it was like a person, kind of like how, you know, Trump and they say Trumpism, that somebody is following that particular person. So that brought to mind that I had read, although people said that there were like millions of people in Mesopotamia, I don't know, I haven't found that, but I have found where there were a population of at least 50,000 or more. So if that was the case, who would have that community been who followed the Nestorians who later called themselves, or Nestorius who later called themselves Nestorians?
Oof, that's a very multifaceted question. Let me see if I
You have to read the book.
break it down.
Probably an easier way.
So I can start by just mentioning some facts about Nestorius as we know him through history books, and then move you back to how the labels developed. Okay. So Nestorius was, as you pointed out, the patriarch. He was a patriarch of Constantinople during the Byzantine and Roman Empire, and he was condemned during a Christological dispute regarding the nature of Christ. He was condemned as a heretic in the year of 431 and the Common Era during the Council of Ephesus. And that condemnation and excommunication led to his exile to Arabia and created a long-lasting schism between the Byzantine Church and the Church of the East. Now, the Church of the East is the origin of all the modern people that we call today Assyrians and Chaldeans. They all originated as followers of the Church of the East, or sometimes it's called the Ancient Church of the East. And there is a little bit of a misconception about their identity as Nestorians. First of all, they never ever used that term to refer to themselves because it was a pejorative term. It was used by outsiders to refer to them as a church that refused to condemn Nestorius during the Council of Ephesus. It's one of the churches that decided to not condemn him, to be neutral and to question his teachings and at some point maybe accept them, but they were never Nestorians to begin with, and the label was always pejorative. It was applied to them from the outside, and they preferred to refer to themselves as Suriaya or Syrians. And that was the label they used for themselves as users of a Syriac language and the followers of the Church of the East. And they went back by that name, by that label for a long time until they began converting to Catholicism. And that did not happen until the mid 16th century. So the first conversion that we have recorded in our history books goes back to the year 1553, when a monk by the name of, let me see if I can remember his name, Yohanna Sulaqa of Rabban Hormuz Monastery in Mosul, who was the first to obtain the Chaldean title from Pope Julius III, who proclaimed him Patriarch Simon VIII of the Chaldeans. That is the first recorded history that links the term Chaldeans to the Christian people. Okay. Before that, we have some disputed references. For example, in the 13th century, a historian by the name of Ibn al-Ibri used the term somewhat also pejoratively to refer to the people of the Eastern Church, called them Chaldeans in reference to the biblical Chaldeans as magicians and sorcerers. So it's not exactly the same title that was supposed to honor these people when it was given by the Pope. This was just a pejorative reference. Now, a lot of theories about how the two communities were linked have to do more with their language, linguistic identity, and geographical identity rather than ethnic identity. For example, one scholar suggested that that the Pope in Rome chose to bestow this term, the Chaldean, on the followers of the Church of the East because they occupied the same location in Mesopotamia as the ancient Chaldean Empire. So it made sense to give them this honorary title in the 16th century. Another argument said well, they speak Neo-Aramaic, which is a language that evolved from the Aramaic that was spoken during the Chaldean Empire, during the time of the Chaldean Empire. So it made sense to link them historically to those people. So the question we am is not so much whether or not the modern Chaldeans are the same or not as the Chaldeans of olden times, but I try to disentangle a different set of problems in my book. One of them, which is a big one for our community and for the Assyrian community, it's a question that pops up in social media a lot. Are we the same people or are we not? Now, this question, if you look back at actual historical records, is really easy to answer, because for over 12 centuries, from the year of the creation of the Church of the East, all the way to the Catholic conversions that gave us the Chaldean title, for those 12 centuries, we were all the same people in the same church, the Church of the East. Now, if you overlook those 12 centuries and go back to pre-Christian history, then you create a historical fallacy, because you're trying to trace the modern Assyrians to the ancient Assyrians and the modern Chaldeans to the ancient Chaldeans.
But then the question would be, why would it be a fallacy then? Then even when the Pope, if he designated that name, could there have been some kind of historical element to it? Because we had both read, and it's in your book as well, you reference the Chaldean book of Genesis. You reference that book, but some of the things that I had read in that book is just different. And I brought it to your attention that it was written by George Smith, and he's an Assyrian archaeologist, and he was British, and he went to Nineveh, and then he found in their library all these the cuneiforms, and there was so many tablets showing that the Assyrians had taken on stories from Chaldeans. He mentions Chaldeans and Babylonians, and then they changed these stories, which when I read that, it wasn't such a surprise, because that was normally what would happen from one empire to the next. The Assyrians and then the Akkadians come along, and then each one tries, the victor is the one with the story. So I wasn't as surprised by that. And unfortunately, sometimes it feels like that pattern still to this day kind of continues. But and then I also had read that there was still tens and tens of thousands of cuneiforms that still need to be translated and everything. So could there be some historical aspect that is still tied to all of this? And I mean, of course, we would not be able to prove that this is 100% or this is 1%. We don't know. But could these purposes have been more historical than just a religious or a prestigious purpose or political purpose? I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. So this is an excellent question, Liam. I think everybody in our modern Chaldean and Assyrian communities has asked that question at some point, especially with such intensive representation of us as the descendants of these ancient empires. Now, here is the answer that I found out through my research. There's absolutely a connection, because we have no proof that we are not the descendants of the ancient Chaldeans and Assyrians. And that is attested through the continuous population of the region of Mesopotamia since the fall of these empires, and the continuous use of the Aramaic language. Now, but here is the catch. Here's the problem that I try to disentangle. I do not dispute that we are the descendants of these ancients, but here are the two issues that we don't deal with, which makes our representation selective in kind of odd ways. The region was populated by a lot of different groups during the Assyrian Empire, which fell in the year 612 BCE, and during the Chaldean dynasty, which was the last dynasty of the Babylonian Empire, which fell in the year 539 BCE. Now, if you look at this history, there's the Church of the East did not come into being until 8 centuries later, okay? 8 centuries later, 4th century CE. So what happened during this 8th century gap? You had all these people, all these different tribes who mixed and mingled in Mesopotamia. spoke Aramaic and varieties of Syriac and other languages, and eventually a segment of them converted to Christianity, became the ancient church of the East. What about the rest of those people? They're also descendants of the Assyrian and the Chaldean Empire. So all the people who were in the region, not only the Christian converts, can claim descent from the Chaldean and the Assyrian Empire. So what does it mean for us to claim exclusive descent? And isn't it misleading to say that, well, the modern Assyrians are descendants of the ancient Assyrians and the modern Chaldeans are descendants of the ancient Chaldeans? Because those labels were not revived until much, much later, until 12 centuries later. So the real answer, if we want to be honest, is that all of those Mesopotamians, all of the descendants of the Mesopotamian people of pre-Christian times can claim descent from the Chaldean and the Assyrian empires. Does that make sense?
It does. I do see what you're saying, because I think it's like the communities are caught up about like who's first, who did this, who's the original. And I think I understand what you're saying is in this book, you're trying to help us to inform through so much research really that you did in the history, that I think we've maybe gotten lost in the purpose of why we're trying to obtain this identity, not so much as maybe the Native Americans wanting to reconnect and really honor their ancestry, but as you said, it's kind of a more for political gains, including, and not taking the time to look at something like you brought up the word Assyrian, that there's and I had heard about this before, but I had never seen it referenced, where you mentioned that, sorry, I have to look it through.
It's page 33.
Yes, it is. Yes, it says the earliest appearance of the Assyrian appellation took place in the late 19th century through the intervention of the Church of England and the American Presbyterian Mission in Urmia. Is that correct?
Yes, Urmia. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I had heard, but I had never seen it referenced, and you referenced this quite a bit. And then I found that interesting. And if anybody who is interested to learn more, there's like a lot of details. This is what I like about this book, and I still have to go through a lot of it. But can you share a little bit of that? Because I have heard more about the Chaldean part, and they're not being, connected in the way that you're saying, but I haven't heard so much about the Assyrian part.
Yes, gladly. So for those who will purchase the book, this is all on page 33. And I should mention that I'm not an Assyriologist. So all my discussion is based on scholarship that has been diligently done by Assyriologists and archaeologists who studied their sources, their primary sources, in ways that I didn't. I'm not even a reader of Syriac. So these are not my arguments. These are arguments that have been made by other authoritative scholars before me. For example, the scholar Wolfhard Henrich claims that there was the hypothesis of how the term Assyrian came to be associated with the modern Assyrians, who were followers of the Church of the East, who did not convert to Catholicism and therefore did not earn the title Chaldean. Now, they continued to be followers of the Church of the East, or pejoratively called Nestorians. They did not start thinking of themselves as Assyrians and link their identity to the ancient Assyrians until the 19th century, as you just said, Wiam. And one theory about why they thought they were connected language-wise is this hypothesis of the transition from Syrian. They used to call themselves Syrian, or in their language, Syriaya, to Assyrian. Now, Assyrian or Syriaya was the most common self-designation for centuries, and yet it's degraded to a form known today as Suraya. Now, Suraya was also common and eventually enabled the link to Assyrian. So that's one theory. The other one, so that's the theory, it's called of the lost A, the last Alif, Alif letter, the letter Alif in the Syriac in the Arabic alphabet, the first letter. The idea was that it dropped, it was lost, and then it was reclaimed, it was restored. The other theory has to do with the name Assyrian coming from the Greek language, which converted Atur Assyria in Aramaic to Ashur. Yeah, and that in turn became Sur and eventually Syria. So the idea is that Atur or Athur was the Aramaic form of Assyria, and it was used in the Middle Ages and referenced the area that surrounded the Nineveh, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. So the term Asuri, or eventually Athuri or Ashuri, all came to reference Assyrians or Syrians. So there's a lot of conflation of terms, and in the Syriac language, we know these terms today as Asuraya or Athuraya. And they're used in Arabic as well in Iraq to reference the people. And interestingly, there is a distinction between who we call in Arabic Athuris, who are the modern Assyrians, and they are usually in Arabic culture completely distanced from the ancient Assyrians, whom we call in Arabic Ashuris. So there's Ashuriyin and Athuriyin. And the link is not made between the two in the Arabic culture. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I know the politics behind it in the 1980s when the Ba'ath Party tried to claim descent from the Assyrian Empire themselves. What they wanted to do is to distance this Christian community from its exclusive claim to the ancients and claim that all Iraqis were descendants from the Assyrians, including Saddam Hussein himself, and that the modern Ashuris were different people than the ancient Ashuris, from which all Iraqis descended, were different from the modern Athuris, who were refugees and newcomers to Iraq, who only entered the region after the genocide in World War I in 1915 as refugees, and they were housed in the refugee camps near Habbaniya and elsewhere in Iraq. So they were conceptually separated deliberately in state propaganda. And perhaps as a relation to that, we have the strong claim that the modern Assyrians have today to their ancient identity, because they were forcefully separated, divorced from it through political regimes.
Yes, and you know, because their experience of genocide and things, and even recently what has even happened, I found that even now with what happened in 2014, there was an additional, like a stronger kind of attempt for revival. The unfortunate part a little bit is kind of what's happening between the Chaldeans and the Assyrians, and that label and the name that's creating more tension, and with other groups. But so I see what you mean with regards to identity and everybody thinking, there's a separateness and maybe using it for political advantages. But given the amount of work that you've put into this and the years and the research and the interviews and everything else, what healing message would you give to the community that they can take away from this? As is always the most difficult part, as I don't view myself as an authority figure to tell anybody how they should behave or carry themselves in life. But what has worked for me as a descendant from this extremely complex and conflated history, what has worked for me is honesty, stark honesty, accepting a critical inquiry, even if it takes me to places where my community is presented in less idealized positive terms. Seeking the truth, always seek the truth. Don't stop at prepackaged conceptions of self or community, and don't settle down for historical accounts of who you are. Seek the real history, it's out there. It only takes a little bit of digging, a little bit of diligence, and you can find real answers instead of settling for what your politicians want you to believe, or your church members want you to believe, or your family wants you to believe. If you want to really know the answers, then seek them yourself. Don't shy away from doing some historical digging. That's very beautiful. And yeah, I mean, it's nice to be, it's healthy, I think, to be open-minded and looking on who we are, because we have a dark side too. Not everything that happened, a lot of very bad things happen in ancient Mesopotamia that we need to also look at, not just the good, the things that we built, but there was a lot of destruction there as well. So it's very healthy to look at all the aspects, and at the end of the day, just to realize, our title, our identity is foremost as human beings. I mean,
and one last thing.
That's one of, yes, please.
Yeah. One last thing, and I believe you do that in your books, and that's why I really value your contribution to the community. You reach out to them in ways that very few people can through the word. I want to say that if you want to be taken seriously as a community, you have to present that dark side. You can't just focus on the good and the aggrandized and the inflated monumental history, because the communities outside of us do not take that seriously. They want to see the real people behind these agendas. So don't shy away from showing that darkness, because this is what would make you real for people. People who write their histories and are taken seriously are presenting things in a more neutral, critical way to show the world who they are. So if you don't want to be represented by outsiders who are writing these history books and doing their research in Assyriology, then you need to contend with all sides of the truth and not just one.
Excellent point. Yes, because in order for us to even continue, another thing that I appreciate about this book is because, as I mentioned, that a lot of the people that I have interviewed, we often talk about the lack of books on this subject that are available. And so you're filling a void. And I encourage writers, oftentimes when writers reach out to me, and I see that they're vulnerable, they feel, afraid to be vulnerable, So they're afraid to be vulnerable and to address some of the things. And I said, no, this is really what will make your story strong. And this is important for us as writers, as individuals, and it's important for our community, which you have just said that. So, and given that you are observing this from outside the community, so to take that to heart and to take it seriously. So thank you, Yasmeen. We need to have you back in an hour because there's so much questions. Honestly, like maybe in the future, just have a workshop or something where we can discuss this, or a forum, a bigger forum, so that we can discuss these in more details.
That would be lovely.
Yes, and we will have a link to Yasmeen Hanoosh's book, The Chaldeans. It's available, as I mentioned, on Amazon. We will have a link to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.